we're now on the verge of elections in Egypt, uncertainty in the direction of Egyptian politics, relationships between the SCAF on the one hand and the new leadership, the new civilian political leadership. When one looks at the political combatants, Muslim Brotherhood, Salafists, the military, less so the sort of liberal secular opposition, where does the Sinai fit in? Does anybody have an interest in reasserting security in the Sinai? And does anybody have an interest in the Sinai as a zone of potential insecurity, perhaps to keep the border with Israel hot, perhaps for other reasons? Gentlemen, please, from the microphone up here.
Oh, okay. So, number one, the single most important organized party in the Sinai is, guess, the Muslim Brotherhood. My Bedouin friends in Arish and the area are telling me they will sweep most of the Sinai seats. Hamas understands that the Muslim Brotherhood is becoming a major player in Egyptian politics in the next parliament. And they see an axis being formed between Gaza and Cairo, which passes through the Sinai. I don't have a good answer on the question of how the Muslim Brotherhood sees developments along the Israeli border. It's one thing what happens to the peace treaty. The previous, at least, position of the Muslim Brotherhood was that it should be resubmitted to a referendum post-Mubarak. Not all of them are saying that, not all of them are repeating that, but that was the position. But I simply don't have an answer. I don't know. What do they think about the possibility that the arc of resistance will be extended from the Gaza Strip down south into the Sinai? That's a big question mark. And if I'm here, just one point that I think is important. The Egyptian army is allowed to keep in the Sinai 22,000 in where?
In Zone A.
Yeah, in Zone A. And mechanized division or so. They normally, our estimate, keep in the Sinai only 70 to 80% of the forces they are allowed to hold in the Sinai. During the revolution, they took forces out of the Sinai to help in the Delta cities and elsewhere. Even when they were allowed to, through this agreement with Israel, to move more battalions into Area C, in all cases, to the best of my information, they did not take advantage of the whole number of troops that they were allowed to commit. But it was always quite considerably less. And I gave the example, which I think is very telling, about the tanks.
Thank you. Norm?
Going backwards, traditionally Zone A, which has allowed 22,000 troops, is really Kazerne forces plus regular training activities. So if they had a problem in Zone C, which is at the border, they would not take them from these units. They would go to Ismailia, to the 2nd Field Army Headquarters, or to Suez, to the 3rd Field Army Headquarters. And the numbers approved were a cap. There's a maximum that the Israeli authorities allowed to go to Zone C. There was not a fixed number, and the Egyptians must announce name, almost by name, but by vehicle and exact number of officers and so on. And they sent only what they thought they needed. It may have been inadequate, but that's what they did. They still have people in Zone A, and there's no telling when those will pull out. Now, the question is that enough to do the only thing the military can do, which is to keep elements moving from, let's roughly Rafah down to Taba? That is a parallel to the border. They cannot put enough soldiers online to stop anyone from going from Sinai into the Negev right now. It's just too long of a line. I'm not sure how many people it would take. Now, will the Brotherhood or the Palestinians from Gaza or others try to exploit the situation? Of course they will. But my question would be, if the Brotherhood has gained or will gain some of its demands in Cairo, maybe there's really no need for them to be doing too much aggressively in the Sinai. I don't think they're focusing on the Sinai any more than anyone else. But the military is determined, A, to protect the Constitution, and B, to keep the Sinai within its bailiwick at this point, no matter what it takes. Now, let's take this a little farther. Why is the military interested? Part of it is, of course, the sovereignty of Egypt and the control of this buffer called the Sinai. At the same time, the military has a lot of holdings, let's call them that, along the coast from Sharm el-Sheikh to Taba. When land is sold to new hoteliers or resort builders, very often it's sold by the military because all of the Sinai is considered military turf, pretty much. So you're not going to give this away quite freely, which is part of what the Bedouins would like, is to gain territory for which they could be registered, which the government's not allowing right now. So this is part of the game that will be played out, a transfer of certain privileges perhaps to the Bedouins that they don't have. This is something the government can give. Turnover of some lands, maybe investment in new housing for those who have inadequate housing. This has come up before, but the government only offered about $10,000 a house in Rafah. So there are nonviolent options, and there are things to trade off. But if you have a determined force in the Sinai, I can't see, no matter how many military you put in there, that you can stop cross-border activity. That sounds sort of negative, but the sealing of the border will be done in ways other than just building walls. But right now, the border is, at some points, it's almost fictitious. It was 5 or 6 years ago, I believe it was, an entire tribe that crossed the border one night. Azazma, yes. Because, as you may know, among the Bedouins, all of their government is internal. Their trials are internal, criminal trials, spousal abuse trials. They have their own courts, their own judges, no jails, but you have to pay a fine determined by generally the value of a camel. And this tribe couldn't pay, so if you don't pay, you can be attached to another tribe. I think in this case it was the Tarabain. And they were threatened, so they just picked up their tents and crossed into Israel overnight. And the Israelis called back the next day, say, "Are you missing a tribe?" And you know, so there's a lot of,
because they have experience losing them.
yeah.
Think about it.
Do you want them back? None of them have visas. Anyway, I don't think that the Brotherhood will focus very quickly, or any group will focus quickly on the Sinai. I think a lot of what the military will do in the long term will depend on what they do in Cairo, up through and a little bit beyond the presidential elections.
Okay, thank you. David on the left.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation to both of you. To Norm, I guess my question is, you know, when the MFO was set up, it was under very different circumstances. It was to, you know, reduce fears that somehow that Egypt would somehow capitalize on Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. Given all these unbelievable changes that both of you have just described, if you had to advise, you know, the Secretary of Defense here in this country, in Israel, or in Egypt, what changes would you make to the MFO structure to make it more relevant to deal with some of these current challenges? And Ehud, and maybe also Norm, if you could just elaborate a little bit more about, this fence that is rapidly going up on the Egypt-Israel border. How much do you see it as reducing the commercial dimension of the smuggling? People, there have been fences on the Egypt-Gaza border that have not been effective, but that's because the IDF was not on either side of them. But here you will have the IDF on one side like it was in the case of the West Bank. Of course, this is longer than the West Bank, but the scope of this project, if you believe the Haaretz feature, is twice the size of the West Bank fence. It just hasn't gotten any attention yet in the United States. But I just want to know if you could play out more of the implications for Israel of having this new development.
Norm, you want to start?
Yeah, I think the most important structural change to the MFO was allowing me to retire. So, I was told as late as this week that operations are back to normal. The mission is being executed with minimal threat, although the past year has been difficult, particularly secure movements from one place to another. The only thing I would tell them is don't change your mission, because if you get involved in whatever's going on, no matter how inimical, you will be drawn in to the problem, and you might as well concede the mission from that point on. You cannot survive if you can't move an observe and report unit. If it can't go from one post to another, you cannot operate. Now, they could tentatively try to do it all by helicopter, but that's financially not possible. And plus, if they have surface-to-air missiles, but there have been no threats posed to the MFO, even as a result of the revolution, although, like everybody else, there were strikes to raise salaries and so on. And this little village of Mahdia is not far from the MFO front gate. But the operations are back to normal. And interestingly, the number of donor countries to support the MFO just recently increased. So there's tremendous European interest. All of the Scandinavian countries now are contributing, which has just occurred in the last 12 to 24 months. Yeah.
So even though this become like the Egyptian Waziristan, and with all this weaponry coming into Gaza, you wouldn't change anything?
I wouldn't change anything for the MFO, because, to be quite honest, whatever moves in there that doesn't affect the treaty is not really the MFO's business. And again, if they get caught up in all of this activity, reporting on smuggling or hashish fields that are out there in the mountains and so on, they'll be attacked. And as soon as you have a few MFO people killed, the donor countries, those who contribute soldiers, will say, come home. Okay? The value of the MFO is to be able to be there and to report on violations of the treaty.
I'm completely in agreement with Norm. The MFO is not the answer. Now, David, about the barrier. Maybe one or 2 points that I didn't make, that we didn't make before. One, the Egyptians have roughly 300 points along the border. The road there was, if I'm not mistaken, correct me, Norm, was financed by the US government. The road going on the Egyptian side from the Gaza down to Eilat. The Egyptians very often send their prisoners. Do I have to repeat it? They send their prisoners, work prisoners, to man the positions. It's very easy to bribe them for the Bedouins. Very often the Bedouins would attack with fire, no warning. You know the fleet of Toyotas that I was speaking about? Firing into an Egyptian position with few work prisoners. Many of these positions, it's basically towers that have to take care of the border, They don't get supplies often enough. It's very often that Division 80, the Israeli territorial division there, has to supply food. This is the true situation. And I could go on and on with anecdotes. This is the situation. This is how it looks. So the barrier, the new fence, is aimed at allowing the Israelis to see and hear what's on the other side. Because the Israelis have a problem. Even if you have information, and by the way, it should be noted that dozens of terrorist operations, mainly attempts to kidnap Israelis inside the Sinai, were foiled through cooperation between Egypt and Israel. Were foiled. Very often we have the alerts of our counterterrorism agency saying, don't go to the Sinai. And I used to have huge quarrels with my beloved daughter, who loves the Sinai. So the barrier is supposed to let Israel see into the Sinai, block cross-border terrorist operations like the one we have seen on August 18. And when I said suicide bombers, I meant suicide bombers into Israel, because the previous one, suicide bomber that came from the Sinai to Israel and exploded himself in a bakery in Eilat in 2007, was a Palestinian from Gaza. This barrier will allow Israel to protect itself better, and it will affect dramatically the smuggling from and into Israel, mainly drugs, illegal immigrants from Sudan and Eritrea, etc. I happen to know from my Bedouin friends that they have second thoughts now that they see the fence erected, mostly by the way, by Israeli Bedouin workers, working against the clock, because the Bedouins are thinking about the economic implications of having that fence, separating them from their brethren in the Negev and Jordan. It's going to have an economic impact. And some of them are saying, well, was it so fantastic to engage, for those guys to engage in Salem Abu Lafi that Noah mentioned, etc., to engage in terrorism if we are going to lose this business? We don't know how it will work out at the end. I think what it means from an Israeli point of view, Israel no longer, whether they will say it publicly or not, I don't care, I'm not a government official. Israel no longer, and this is true since 2010. In 2010, the Israeli security agencies were saying something is happening in the Sinai. Something is changing. So Israel will view the Sinai border as a border with peace, but with other things as well. There is no other way. It's no longer a border of peace, full stop, exclamation mark.
Why don't we take a number of questions that I have here. We'll start with Carol, then Greg, Rafi, and Peter.
Thank you.
Press the button there.
Thank you. Thank you. I have two questions. One is very factual. We know you've told us how many tribes are on the Sinai. How many people are in the Sinai? And the second question is with regard to Israeli policy, which you sort of touched on in your last answer. Israeli blockade of Gaza has slowly been lifting in various aspects. To what extent has the blockade contributed to the smuggling problem?
Greg, would you just pass the microphone across?
Yes, for either speaker, I'm curious about the appeal of the Salafi ideology to the Bedouin. Is it just simply anti-state reasons that some of them are going there? How big a Salafi population are we talking about? If the bulk of the people are just interested in being just sort of left alone or just engaged in smuggling? Thank you.
Rafi, several people back.
Thank you. First of all, with regard to relations between the Bedouins in the Sinai and in Israel, you call them brethren. Do they always have the same economic interests, or is there some kind of competition for the loot? And number two, with regard to the gas pipeline, isn't it possible to just buy off the Bedouin tribes along the pipeline to provide security, as has been done elsewhere? Isn't there a way to secure that pipeline?
Peter, up in front here.
Ehud, you referred to the episode between Israel and Egypt on the border in August. What happened? What was it all about? Secondly, the Bedouin village in the Negev, which has been torn down, 6 or 7 times and rebuilt, what's that all about?
And gentlemen, lastly, is there any outside third-party role in what is going on in the Sinai? Are the Salafis receiving any aid from Saudis? Is there any outside role in everything that we've been talking about today? So, series of questions. We only have a few minutes. Ehud, you want to start with this?
I assume it has to be in bullets, in brief. So, how many people in the Sinai? Nobody really knows. Let's say 400 plus, maybe 500,000. Depends how you count Egyptians who work there, etc. That's roughly the number. The impact of the blockade. Hamas is taxing the tunnels, making a big profit on the tunnels. There are, of course, military tunnels and trade tunnels, etc. When Hamas wants some stuff to come through the tunnels, they will prevent that stuff coming from the terminals with Israel. They are managing it. In a paper that I wrote earlier this year for the Institute, a policy watch, I try to describe how using this, Hamas, which was a $40 million budget organization, grew to $500 million annual budget organization. It's part of this same story that we were discussing. Salafis. Egyptian authorities are telling me they count about 1,600 Salafis. I think there are more. We see it in all the tribes. Huaytat, and everywhere you look in the Sinai, you see this phenomenon. I cannot claim that I reached the bottom of this. But it started. We know some of the people who are behind it. We understand and we know the organizations that they have, the associations, Dawah associations in El Arish and the area. We know the personalities, not those who are the military people. I think it's fewer than probably 2,000-3,000 people or more. Buy off the Bedouins with Israel. It's relations of cooperation. Just to explain to you how smuggling works, the Sinai Bedouin will take the immigrants, the drugs, the weapon, whatever it is he's leading, up to 3 or 4 kilometers short of the Israeli border. The Israeli Bedouin will go into the Sinai, sometime with the Toyota pickup, and bring it in Israel because he knows the way. Mostly, it takes place in a strip of about 50 kilometers, which is used by the Bedouin as the main corridor. Is it possible, Rafi, to buy the local Bedouin tribes to secure the gas pipeline? It's been tried over and over and over again. To pay per kilometer, to let them be the guards, etc. I can tell you that the last no, the one before last explosion in the pipeline was highly sophisticated operation. They managed to put the explosive charge in such a way as to disrupt the flow of gas to Israel and not to disrupt the flow of gas to Jordan. That was somebody extremely professional who knew how to arrange it. August 18, Peter, the idea was kidnapping. They went for kidnapping, trying to kidnap Israelis. That was the whole idea of that operation. I don't have the time to go into this. We'll do it over dinner. It was four groups, and the aim was to kidnap Israelis, and we don't know yet whether the idea then was to get those Israelis into Gaza through the tunnels, Shalit style, or to keep them in the Sinai for some other purpose. We don't know. About the Bedouin, the Israeli Bedouin is a question of settling the Bedouins and ownership of land is very complicated. At times, the police and the courts order the dismantling of some, it's sort of a settlement, a colony that the Bedouins establish. About third parties, Rob, Hezbollah is in the Sinai. That's not me saying. That the Egyptians already said. They had this group of Hezbollah, which was based on Palestinians from North Sinai, and Ismailia, which were arrested by the Egyptians. The guy from Hezbollah who was running it fled prison, and he's back had a hero's welcome in Beirut. We see fingerprints of Hezbollah and Iran in the Sinai. Some of the weapons that are smuggled are not smuggled through the Suez Canal from mainland Egypt, but coming by boats from the south, and they have their people there recruited to collect it and move it north. By the way, some of the weapons from Libya, which are reaching Gaza and the Sinai, are coming now by boats, not just overland. And then we have some groups, small ones, who are, at least ideologically, in their style, sort of affiliated or spiritually close to Al-Qaeda. What was important is that the announcement of the establishment, 2 months or so ago, of the establishment of the emirate, of the Qaeda emirate of the Sinai, was removed from all the official Qaeda websites, and at this point, I don't take it seriously.
Norm, any final comments?
Just very quickly, the Salafist movement, when it emerged in the early 2000s, like 2003 and so on, the recruitment was made among high schoolers and disaffected people for the most part. So there wasn't a huge number. When you have to dip down to the high schools and try to get kids recruited, the numbers were not that high. They certainly may be as high as Ehud says now, but they were low then. Disaffected people included professionals who couldn't earn a good living, or they had to give a portion of their salaries to the government, etc. Like the number 4 guy, Mahali, was from the Malhala tribe, which is, you have the 26 that we more or less agree on, but there are many sub-tribes and sub-families. This particular family is one that's considered outcast, cannot marry into the big tribes, and he just wasn't able to make a living, so he moved, get a job with the terrorists. And that was the appeal 7 or 8 years ago. Now it's emerged and developed. As far as the Rafi's question, generally speaking, until recently, all secure locations were received money from the government going to a tribal sheikh who would then pay off some people to provide security. It wasn't really security, just let me know if somebody's out there. The problem is the security services decided some years ago that they would name the tribal sheikhs, which broke down a lot of the leadership mechanisms and so on, which has led to the weak structures now. Now, these new sheikhs were not supported for the most part by the tribes. They were called stamp lickers, supporting the government. They were put into the parliament in some cases, but they maintained no real control. The amount given to manage a stretch of pipeline might have been as little as $50 a month to pay off a bunch of people. Now, I had a couple of sheikhs protecting one of my radar sites or communication sites, and he did pretty good because he could control the roadway going to the mountaintop. And in a quick spin-off story, at one point, the stuff we had up there was stolen, particularly a generator, and we held the sheikh responsible. He applied by Bedouin tribal law, something called Bashai, where you get a hot pan and you basically have the guy stick his tongue out to tell if he's, if he's lying or not. And if his tongue is wet, he's comfortable. If it's dry, he's going to burn. 2 minor sheikhs confessed, and I got my generator back. Okay.
Well, I'd like to see that line item in the congressional budget for the MFO about, sheikh radar defense. Well done, Norm. Gentlemen, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you.